The day Elsie Callahan planted her first row of sorghum without her husband. She did it with shaking hands and a jaw set so tight it ached for a week afterward. That was 3 years ago, in the spring of 1882, when the red dust of Crockett County, Texas, still felt foreign beneath her boots, and the silence of the Callahan homestead pressed against her chest like a stone she could not roll away. Thomas Callahan had been dead 4 months by then, dead from a fever that had taken him too quickly, too quietly, in a way that felt almost like an insult after everything he had survived on the frontier. He had ridden through Apache raids and cattle stampedes, and two of the worst droughts Crockett County had seen in a generation, and then a fever had come up in December, and that had been the end of Thomas Callahan. He had loved sorghum the way some men loved whiskey or gambling or the sound of their own voices. He talked about it with a reverence that Elsie had always found quietly amusing. He would stand at the edge of their modest acreage with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and say things like, "Elsie, there is no finer grain on God's earth." And Elsie would say, "Thomas, you say that every season," and he would grin at her and say, "And every season I am right." She had not grown up farming sorghum. She had grown up in San Antonio in a household that was not wealthy but was comfortable, and her father had been a merchant, and her mother had kept a kitchen garden of tomatoes and peppers, and a handful of herbs that smelled wonderful on summer evenings. Sorghum had never been a part of her life. She had married Thomas at 22 and followed him west to the rough land he had claimed with a land certificate and 2 seasons' worth of stubborn labor. And she had learned to be a farm wife the way you learn most hard things, by failing at it repeatedly until you stop failing quite so badly. She had never loved sorghum. Not the planting of it, not the growing of it, not the harvesting of it, not the grain syrup Thomas made from the heads every fall that he would pour over his cornbread with an expression of absolute satisfaction, while she sat across the table thinking that it tasted like something between molasses and a mistake. She endured the sorghum. She performed her duties around the sorghum. She was, at best, neutral about the sorghum. But Thomas was gone, and the sorghum seed was sitting in the barn in the same ceramic jar he had stored it in every winter. And planting, it felt like the only thing left in the world that made any sense. Their neighbors, the Whitfield family 2 miles east, had come by in March to offer their condolences again and their help with the plowing, and Harlan Whitfield had stood at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and suggested, gently, that Elsie might consider moving back to San Antonio, or at least leaving the farming to someone who knew what they were doing, since running this acreage alone was no small thing for a woman on her own. Elsie had thanked him politely and closed the door. She had a daughter, Clara, who was 6 years old and had Thomas's dark eyes and his stubbornness in full measure, and a hired hand named Pete who was 63 years old, half-deaf in one ear, and entirely unwilling to quit no matter what Elsie said because, as he explained it, he had worked this land since before Thomas had planted the first post of the fence line, and he was not about to stop now. Pete was worth his weight in whatever currency you cared to name, and Elsie was grateful for him with a depth that she could not always put into words. She planted the sorghum. She planted it again the following spring, in 1883, while Clara ran between the rows and Pete pretended not to watch Elsie to make sure she was doing it right. She planted it again in the spring of 1884, by which point the whole county knew that the Callahan widow planted sorghum every season without fail, and people said things about it that ranged from respectful to baffled. A widow woman planting sorghum alone on 50 acres with one old hired hand and a 7-year-old child. It was, to put it plainly, an act of pure, unreasonable stubbornness. Elsie knew it was stubbornness. She was not under any illusion about that. She did not love the sorghum. She did not love the backbreaking work of the planting, the constant attention it required through the summer growing months, the harvesting in late summer when the Texas heat was still murderous, the processing of the grain. She did not wake up every morning thinking about how glad she was to be a sorghum farmer. But Thomas had loved it, and she was still here, and so the sorghum was still here, and that was simply the way things were. It was on a Tuesday morning in early April of 1885 that Marshall Norris rode onto the Callahan property for the first time. Elsie was in the south field when she heard hoofbeats coming up the main approach, and she straightened from where she had been crouching to examine the soil conditions and watched a man on a dark bay horse come through the gate she had left open that morning. He was not a young man, and he was not an old man. Somewhere in the middle of his 30s, she guessed, with a broad-brimmed hat pushed back on his head and the kind of build that came from years of outdoor work. He had a lawman star pinned to his vest, which she could see catching the morning sun from 50 feet away. She did not panic. Elsie Callahan had reached a point in her life where panic felt like too much energy to spend on things that had not yet proven themselves to be worth panicking over. She walked to meet him at the edge of the field, wiping her hands on the front of her work apron. He stopped his horse and looked down at her with brown eyes that were not unfriendly. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for the Callahan homestead. I was told this was the place." "You found it," Elsie said. "I'm Elsie Callahan." "What can I do for you, Marshall?" "Marshall Norris," he said, and swung down from the saddle with the easy motion of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He held out his hand and Elsie shook it, which surprised him slightly. She could tell by the brief pause before he adjusted his grip. Most women in Crockett County in 1885 did not shake hands with visiting lawmen. "I'm the new county deputy out of Fort Stockton. I've been making rounds on the county properties, introducing myself, since I'm new to the territory. Your nearest neighbors, the Whitfields, said I ought to stop here." "Harlan Whitfield sent a lawman to my door," Elsie said, not quite able to keep the dry note out of her voice. Marshall Norris read the tone correctly because a very faint smile crossed his face and then went away. "He mentioned there'd been some trouble with cattle being moved off properties along this stretch of road. I'm not suggesting anything about your situation in particular, Mrs. Callahan. Just making sure folks in the area know there's a deputy who can be reached if needed." "I appreciate that," Elsie said, which was a true thing. The last deputy had been a man named Cobbs who had been more interested in the saloon in Fort Stockton than in the actual duties of his position, and she had once ridden half a day to report a fence being cut and found him 3 whiskeys into his afternoon. "Have you seen much of the cattle trouble yourself yet?" "Enough to know it's organized and not just opportunistic," he said. He had a way of speaking that was direct without being blunt, which she noticed because it was not common. Most men she had known swung between 2 extremes. They were either so blunt they were rude, or they wrapped everything in so many careful words it was impossible to find the actual meaning. "I'm also told you run this land yourself, Mrs. Callahan." "I do," she said. "And you're planting sorghum this season." "I plant sorghum every season." He looked out over the south field where she had been working, and then at the barn and the house and the north field beyond, taking in the layout of the property with the kind of systematic attention that she associated with men who spent their lives assessing situations quickly. "That's a significant operation for one person." "I have help," Elsie said. "Pete Garland has worked this land for years, and my daughter helps where she can." "How old is your daughter?" "9, Elsie said. "She's in school this morning." There was a small school 4 miles down the road that had been established 2 years prior, and Clara went every day, that weather permitted, with a seriousness about her education that made Elsie simultaneously proud and slightly terrified that she had produced a child more academically inclined than herself. Marshall Norris nodded. He did not say anything about it being unusual for a frontier child to attend school regularly, which was the response Elsie had been expecting and which she had prepared a response to. Instead, he said, "I'll be riding this stretch regularly. If you have any trouble with the cattle situation or anything else, you can send word to Fort Stockton and I'll come out." "I'll keep that in mind," Elsie said, and because her mother had raised her to be a decent host regardless of the circumstances. "Would you like some water before you go? It's a long ride in from the east." He accepted the water, which meant he stood at her kitchen door for 10 minutes while she filled a cup from the pump, and he drank it and looked out over her land with that same quiet, assessing expression. She noticed that he did not look at her property the way most men did, as a problem to be solved or a burden that needed taking off her hands. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that is functioning and wants to understand how. "Good land," he said, handing the cup back. "It is," Elsie agreed. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode back out through the gate. Elsie stood in her kitchen doorway and watched him go, and then went back to the south field to finish her assessment of the soil conditions, because the sorghum needed to be in the ground within the next 2 weeks and she had work to do. She did not think about Marshall Norris much over the next several days. She was too busy. April on a sorghum farm in Crockett County was a month that did not leave much room for thinking about anything other than soil and seed, and the particular anxiety that came with waiting to see whether the rains were going to cooperate this year. She had good years and bad years, the way every farmer did, and this year she was cautiously hopeful because the winter had been wet enough to put good moisture in the ground. Pete helped her begin the planting on a Thursday, and Clara came home from school that afternoon and immediately kicked off her school shoes and demanded to help. So all 3 of them were out in the south field until the light got too low to see properly. And when they came back to the house, Elsie made cornbread and beans for supper, and Clara told them both everything she had learned that day about the geography of the eastern United States. And Pete pretended to listen while actually falling half asleep over his bowl, and it was, Elsie thought, staring at the lamp flame after Clara had gone to bed, not a bad life. A life with a hole in it, shaped exactly like Thomas, but not a bad life. She thought about what she would tell Thomas if she could. She thought she would tell him the farm was still standing, which he would have wanted to know. She thought she would tell him Clara was growing up into something remarkable. She thought she would tell him the sorghum was going in again this year, and she could picture perfectly the expression that would cross his face, that warm, surprised gratitude, the same face he made when she had done something he had not expected from her. She poured out the last of the cold coffee and went to bed. The trouble with the cattle started about 3 weeks into April. It was not Elsie's cattle. She kept a modest herd for dairy and for her own use, nothing worth organized rustling, but the Whitfields had lost 12 head over 2 nights, and word spread through the county fast the way word always spreads through small places. Harlan Whitfield came by on a Sunday afternoon to tell her personally, partly because he was a decent neighbor and partly, Elsie suspected, because he wanted to see how she would react and whether she needed to be told to be more careful. She was careful already. She had learned to be careful the way you learn everything on this land by necessity. Marshall Norris came back to her property 4 days after Harlan's visit, this time not alone. He had a man with him from Fort Stockton, a deputy's assistant named Cole, who was young and angular and looked simultaneously eager and terrified in the way of young men who have not yet decided whether they are brave or not. Marshall Norris had clearly already decided, long ago, and the difference between them was visible from 100 yards. They found Elsie and Pete in the north field, which was the harder of the 2 fields to manage because the soil there had a clay content that made drainage unpredictable. She had been working on a drainage ditch along the north edge all morning and was muddy to the elbow and not at her most presentable, a fact she noted with the mild irritation of someone who has long since stopped being particularly concerned about such things but still notices them. "Mrs. Callahan," Marshall Norris said, pulling up his horse. "Sorry to interrupt. We've been following some sign that comes from the North Road, and I wanted to let you know we think whoever is taking the Whitfield's cattle has been using the drainage easement along your north boundary as part of their route." Elsie looked at Pete, who straightened up and looked at the north boundary with the expression of a man recalibrating several things at once. "I noticed some tracks last week that didn't belong to any of our animals," Pete said slowly. "I thought it might be the Jenkins boy cutting across." "It's not the Jenkins boy," Marshall Norris said. He did not elaborate on how he knew this, but his tone was certain. "I'd like your permission to check that easement and the fence line along the north edge." "We won't disturb your field." "You have it," Elsie said. "Do what you need to do." He nodded and turned his horse toward the north boundary, and Cole followed him, and Elsie watched them go with a strange sense of something she could not immediately name. It was not quite worry, and it was not quite comfort. It was more like the sensation of noticing that someone was paying attention to things that affected her, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about that. She went back to the drainage ditch. They worked along the north fence line for an hour and a half, while she and Pete continued their work 20 yards south. She was aware of Marshall Norris's presence in the way you are aware of a sound that is steady and predictable and therefore not alarming, a background presence rather than an intrusion. She heard him speaking occasionally to Cole in a low, even voice, and she heard Cole's higher, more excitable responses, and she registered all of it without particularly listening to any of it. At one point, Marshall Norris came back toward the field and she looked up from the drainage ditch. "There's been traffic through here," he said. "Fairly recent. I'd recommend keeping your horses in the barn at night for the next few weeks rather than the paddock, as a precaution." "Understood," Elsie said. "I'll ride this stretch more frequently until we sort this out." "I'd appreciate that." He paused, and she thought he was going to say something else, but then he looked at the drainage ditch she had been digging and said instead, "That's going to help this field considerably. The clay layer is about 18 inches down on this end." She blinked at him. 16, give or take. You can see it in the cross-section where we started." She pointed to where the ditch began, where the layers of soil were visible in profile. He walked over and looked at it with genuine interest. "You've done this before." "3 times, she said. "The first time I got it wrong and flooded the southwest corner of the north field so badly we lost a third of the sorghum." Thomas nearly cried. She stopped, because she had not expected to say Thomas's name to a man she barely knew, and the sound of it in her own voice was strange. Marshall Norris was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you lose your husband, Mrs. Callahan?" 3 years and 4 months, she said, which was a more precise answer than most people expected. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the way people usually said it, with the vague social discomfort that came from not knowing what else to offer. He said it straight and simple, the way he said most things. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was curious and because she had stopped pretending not to be curious about things some time ago, "Have you been a lawman long?" "About 8 years," he said. "Started in Kansas and worked my way south. Crockett County is about as far south as I've gone so far." "Do you have family nearby?" "No," he said, without elaboration, and something in the single syllable told her that the no was the entirety of the story and she should not push it. She nodded and went back to the drainage ditch. He returned to Cole and the fence line. 20 minutes later they mounted up and rode out, and Pete watched them go and then looked at Elsie with an expression she chose to ignore. "He seems competent," Pete said. "Yes," Elsie said, "more competent than Cobbs ever was." "That is an extremely low bar, Pete. I'm just saying." "You're not just saying anything, Pete. You're fishing. Dig." He dug, grinning to himself, and Elsie pretended not to see the grin. The sorghum went into the ground in the last week of April as she had planned. The season unfolded as these seasons did, with constant labor and constant attention, and the particular anxiety of a farmer who cannot control the one thing that determines whether the work matters, which is the weather. May brought good rains, which was encouraging. June brought heat that was fierce even by Texas standards, and Elsie spent those weeks at war with her well, which was threatening to drop below the level she needed, and with the weeds, which were never sympathetic to the difficulties she was already managing. Marshall Norris came by twice in May on his rounds and once in early June. Each visit was brief and professional, and each one ended with him tipping his hat and riding away while Pete watched him go, and Elsie refused to watch him go. The cattle rustling situation, resolved in late June when Marshall Norris and 2 other men tracked the operation to a group of 4 men who had been working the county's western ranches for 2 months. The arrest was made without what he would call significant trouble, which Elsie interpreted to mean there had been a certain amount of non-significant trouble involved, but that everyone who mattered had come through it intact. She heard the details from Harlan Whitfield, who had heard them from the storekeeper in town, who had heard them from someone in Fort Stockton. The Whitfields were pleased. The whole county was generally relieved. Elsie was relieved for her horse's sake, since they had been in the barn every night for 6 weeks and were developing opinions about it. Marshall Norris came by in early July, and this time he stayed longer. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the week's work had made a dent in the sorghum rows that needed attention, and she was sitting on the front porch with a glass of water and the uncomfortable sensation of not having enough energy left to do the next thing on the list when she heard hoofbeats. Clara was inside with a book. Pete was at his own small cabin on the east edge of the property, which was where Pete went on Sunday afternoons to do whatever Pete did on Sunday afternoons. She watched Marshall Norris come through the gate, and she sat up straighter without quite deciding to. He came to the porch and took his hat off, which meant he intended to stay for more than a minute, and she said, "I heard they caught the rustlers," and he said, "We did," and she said, "Come and sit down." And so he tied his horse to the rail and came and sat in the other porch chair, which had been Thomas's chair, and which no one had sat in for 3 years and 4 months, and Elsie felt the strangeness of it and chose not to let it stop her. "I wanted to come and formally let you know the situation is resolved," he said, "and also to make sure you hadn't had any direct trouble on your property." "Nothing beyond the tracks," she said. "Your advice about the horses kept everything settled." He nodded. They sat in a companionable quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She was not used to silence with people she barely knew being anything other than uncomfortable. "Your sorghum is looking good," he said, looking out toward the south field where the young plants were a determined bright green in the afternoon light. "Better than last year at this point," she agreed. "The May rains helped. You've been farming this land since your husband passed." "Before that," she said. "We farmed it together, but alone since then, yes. Sorghum every season." "Every season," she confirmed. He looked at her with an expression that was curious rather than probing. "Is sorghum your preference, or is that what this land is suited to?" It was an interesting question. Most people did not ask it. Most people either assumed she was farming sorghum because it was the obvious practical choice, or they already knew it had been Thomas's crop, and they asked about it with that particular careful tone people used when they were asking about grief without wanting to say the word. "It's suited to the land," she said. "Thomas chose it for that reason." And then it became his thing, his great passion where the farm was concerned. He could tell you more about sorghum varieties than any man you've ever met. "And for you?" Marshall asked. "The land can support other crops," she said. "We've grown some corn in the East Quarter. Pete keeps a kitchen garden. But you keep planting sorghum." "I keep planting sorghum," she said. She expected him to leave it there, the way people usually did. They accepted the answer that was given and moved on because the territory beneath it was obvious enough. She was planting her dead husband's crop because it had been his, because it was a continuation of something, because stopping felt like something she was not ready to name. But Marshall Norris said, "Do you like it? Sorghum, I mean, as a crop?" And the question was so direct and so entirely unexpected that Elsie Callahan laughed. It was not a polite laugh, and it was not a social laugh. It came up from somewhere in her chest that had been closed for a long time, and it came out with a genuine, startled warmth that surprised her so much that she put her hand over her mouth immediately afterward, not because she was embarrassed, but because she did not quite recognize the sound as something she made. Clara came to the screen door at the sound of it and stood looking at her mother with wide Thomas-dark eyes. Elsie lowered her hand. She was smiling, and the smile felt strange on her face, the way an old coat feels strange when you find it after years in a trunk familiar but slightly foreign, A thing that fits but that you have not worn in so long you had half forgotten you owned it. No, she said, and her voice was warm with it. I do not like sorghum, Mr. Norris, not even slightly. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between surprise and a very careful, very contained kind of warmth. Then why? Because he loved it, she said simply. And I am still here, and so the sorghum is still here. He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly he said, "That's the most honest answer I think I've ever heard." Clara pushed open the screen door and came out onto the porch, looking at Marshall Norris with the frank, appraising stare of a child who has decided to make her own assessments. "Who are you?" she asked. "Clara," Elsie said. "It's all right," Marshall said. He looked at Clara with neither condescension nor the performed enthusiasm some adults used on children they did not know what to do with. "My name is Marshall Norris. I'm the deputy for Crockett County." "Did you catch the men who were taking the Whitfield's cows?" Clara asked. "We did," he said. "Good," Clara said, with the firm satisfaction of someone who believes in justice and is glad to see it enacted. She looked at her mother again and then went back inside, apparently satisfied with her assessment. Marshall Norris stayed another hour. They talked about the county and about Fort Stockton and about the land, and at one point they talked about books, which surprised them both. He had read more than she expected, and she had read more than most people she knew, and they discovered a shared opinion about the quality of certain adventure novels that were popular at the time, which led to a brief, lively disagreement about the merits of a particular author that Elsie found herself enjoying with a completeness that she had not felt about a conversation in some time. When he finally mounted his horse to leave, the late sun was sitting low on the horizon and painting everything the particular orange-gold color that Elsie had always thought was the best thing about Texas, and he looked back at her from the saddle and said, "I enjoyed the conversation, Mrs. Callahan," and she said, "So did I, Mr. Norris," and that was the end of that visit. But it was not the end of the thing. He came back 2 weeks later, and this time it was not on official business at all. He brought a book he thought she might like, which was a straightforward thing to do, and yet managed to be one of the more considered gestures anyone had made toward her in years, because he had listened to which author she had argued in favor of during their last conversation, and he had found a different title by the same writer, and brought it out the 12 miles from Fort Stockton. She stood at her kitchen door with the book in her hands and thought, with a clarity that was almost alarming, that she was in some danger here. Not physical danger, the other kind. She invited him to supper. She did this partly because it was the hospitable thing to do, and she had been raised to be hospitable, and partly because Clara was going to be furious if she found out that Elsie had turned away their visitor before supper, and partly because she was 31 years old and a widow, and had been lonely for a long time in a way that she had gotten very good at not admitting, and Marshall Norris made her laugh, and that was not a small thing. Pete appeared from the direction of his cabin at precisely the moment that she and Marshall were sitting down to eat, which Elsie did not believe for a second was a coincidence. Pete had many qualities. The quality of missing the opportunity to observe developments he was interested in was not among them. She set an extra plate without comment. Pete sat down with an expression of absolute innocence and talked to Marshall Norris about cattle and land conditions and county politics for the entire meal, which meant that Elsie ate her beans and salt pork and watched the two men get comfortable with each other, which happened faster than she expected. Pete was not an easy man to get comfortable with, in her experience. He had liked Thomas because Thomas had earned it over years of demonstrated reliability. He liked Marshall Norris, apparently, somewhat sooner than that, which said something about Marshall Norris that she filed away. Clara interrogated Marshall Norris about what he knew of the geography of Texas, which turned out to be considerable, and he answered her questions seriously rather than indulgently, which meant Clara decided he was intelligent and therefore interesting, which was her primary criterion for people. After supper, Marshall helped her clear the plates, which was not something she had expected, and she said, "You don't need to do that," and he said, "I know," and kept doing it, so she let him. He left at dusk, and she stood at the kitchen door watching him ride out in the long evening light, and Pete appeared at her elbow and said, "He's a good man, Elsie," and she said, "Go to bed, Pete," and he said, "Just saying," and she said, "I know what you're just saying," and he went to bed still grinning. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was troubled exactly, but because she was awake in a way she had almost forgotten she could be, a specific, alert, present kind of awake that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the feeling that something was happening. She told herself it was nothing. She was lonely. A man had been kind to her. That was the whole of it, and it would settle down. It did not settle down. Marshall Norris came back on a Saturday in early August, and this time he came earlier in the morning and stayed through the day. Not in an intrusive way, he offered to help with the sorghum, which needed the heads checked and the lower leaves cleared of the scale insects that were making their inevitable late summer appearance, and she accepted the help because the sorghum needed it and Pete's back was giving him trouble. They worked side by side through the morning rows, and he learned quickly, which she noticed, and he did not offer opinions about how she was managing things, which she appreciated more than she might have been able to explain. She had had many well-meaning visitors over 3 years who had offered opinions. The opinions were always delivered with kindness and received with a suppressed irritation that she had had to do considerable work not to express. Marshall Norris worked beside her and asked questions when he needed to and otherwise paid attention. And by noon, they had done what would have taken her and Pete 2 days with Pete's back in its current condition. They ate lunch on the porch, cold cornbread and the last of the previous day's beans, and a tomato from Pete's kitchen garden that Pete offered with suspicious generosity. And the conversation moved the way it had been moving all morning, which was easily and in multiple directions, and with the occasional detour into territory that was more personal than purely social. She told him about San Antonio and her father's shop, and the particular way that coming to this land had felt both impossibly hard and somehow right in ways she could not have explained at the time. He told her about Kansas and working his first years as a deputy under a sheriff who had been fair-minded and decent, and who had taught him most of what he knew about the job, and about how the sheriff had died of an illness 2 winters ago, and he had needed, after that, to be somewhere that was not the same county, with the same people in the same familiar grief. She understood that completely. She did not say so right away. She let it sit for a moment, the way you let something true sit before you respond to it, and then she said, "You came here to be somewhere different." "I came here to be useful somewhere that needed it," he said. "And different, yes, both. Has it worked?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was direct in a way that made her want to look somewhere else, except that she did not. "It's working better than I expected," he said. They sat in the August heat, and the sounds of the land settled around them, the insects in the grass, the far-off sound of cattle from the direction of the Whitfield property, the creak of the porch boards in the occasional wind, and Elsie thought, "I could stay in this moment for a long time." She thought it, and then she noticed that she had thought it, and the noticing made her feel something complicated, warm and cautious in equal measure, the way you feel when you reach out towards something you want very much and are not sure you deserve. She had loved Thomas Callahan. She had loved him with a full and honest heart, and she had not stopped loving him, and she did not think she would ever stop loving him, because he was in the land and in the sorghum and in Clara's dark eyes, and in the particular sound the barn made in a west wind. But he was also 3 years and 4 months gone, and she was 31, and the land was lonely, and the nights were long, and Marshall Norris made her laugh for the first time in years. She said none of this. Instead, she asked him about the cattle situation in the northern part of the county, where she had heard there was still some trouble, and the conversation moved on in its easy way, and he left in the middle of the afternoon, and she went back to the sorghum with a lighter heart than she had had in a long time. Pete looked at her when she came back into the south field and said nothing at all, which for Pete was the loudest possible statement. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say a word," Pete said. "You were thinking loudly." "Old men are allowed to think loudly," he said. "It's one of the privileges." He went back to examining the leaves for scale insects, and Elsie went back to work, and the August sun beat down on the south field and the sorghum grew, the way it always did, stubborn and steadfast and indifferent to everything except the soil and the rain and the heat it had been planted in. The visit that changed things happened in late August. It was not a planned visit, or not entirely. Marshall came by on a Tuesday evening when the harvest was beginning, and Elsie had been in the field since before dawn, and was on that particular edge of exhaustion that makes everything feel both very sharp and very soft at the same time. Clara had gone to bed early. Pete was at his cabin. The harvest was going well. The grain heads were full, and the processing would start properly the next day. And Elsie was sitting on the porch in the dark for a few minutes before she went to bed, listening to the land, the way Thomas used to say she should do more of. She heard the hoofbeats and was not alarmed. She recognized the rhythm of his horse by then, which was something she noted with a private, complicated feeling. Marshall came up to the porch and she said, "Is something wrong?" Because it was late for a social call, and he said, "Nothing's wrong," and dismounted. "I was riding back from a property east of here and I saw your light and I stopped. I shouldn't have." He said the last part in a different tone, a tone that was quieter and more direct than his usual voice. "Why shouldn't you have?" she asked. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her, and in the lamp light from inside he looked. She thought like a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had arrived at the place where he needed to stop thinking and say it. "Because I think I've been finding reasons to come out this way more than the job requires," he said. "And because that's not fair to you unless you know what the reasons are." Elsie felt her heart move in her chest in a way it had not moved in a very long time. She was very still. "I'm not a man who's good at elaborate words," he said, "so I'll say it plainly. I think about this farm and I think about you, and it's not the professional kind of thinking. I understand if that's not something you want to hear, but I'd rather say it plain and let you tell me what to do with it than keep finding excuses to ride 12 miles out here and pretend I'm here about cattle." The silence after that was the kind that is weight. Elsie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the sorghum standing in the field in the dark behind her, 3 years of stubborn planting, 3 years of doing the next thing and the next thing and the next, and she thought about what it meant that this man was standing at the bottom of her porch steps and telling her the truth because he did not know how to do anything else. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a few weeks that you weren't just here about cattle." "And," he said, "and I haven't told you to stop coming," she said. He was still for a moment, and then the tension in his shoulders changed, and he said, "That's all you're willing to say tonight?" And she said, "Come and sit down, Marshall." And he came up the porch steps and sat in Thomas's chair, and they sat together in the dark for a long time talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. And when he finally left, the sky to the east was beginning to pale, and Elsie went to bed thinking that she was very thoroughly in trouble, and that she found she did not mind. September brought the full harvest, which consumed her entirely for 2 weeks. The sorghum came off the stalks in long days of work that involved her and Pete, and 2 men Pete had arranged to come help for hire. And the processing of the grain and the preparation of the syrup from the heads was a full week of additional effort after that. It was the kind of season that leaves you wrung out and satisfied in equal measure. The particular satisfaction of work completed, of a season carried through from beginning to end. Clara made herself useful with a focused seriousness, and was insufferably pleased with herself when Pete told her she had done the work of a grown person, which was true, and which Elsie confirmed, and which made Clara so happy that she was visibly trying not to show it. Marshall came during the harvest twice, once to help, which he did without being asked and without making a production of it, and once in the evenings when the work had quieted down, bringing a bottle of cider from the store in town, which they shared on the porch while the harvest moon hung enormous and orange over the south field, and Pete fell asleep in his chair within 20 minutes of sitting down. And Clara stayed up far past her bedtime because she had decided she wanted to learn the name of every visible star, and Marshall was helping her identify them. Elsie watched her daughter lean over the porch railing pointing at the sky and Marshall leaning beside her, explaining what he knew about the constellations, which was more than most people but less than a scholar, which he admitted freely, and which made Clara decide that she needed more books about astronomy, and Elsie thought, this is a thing that could be real. This could actually be a real and good thing. She did not say that to anyone, but she thought it fully and clearly for the first time. In October, when the harvest was in and the account books showed a good year, good enough to keep the land clear through winter, and to start next season with some comfort, Marshall took her to supper in Fort Stockton. This was an event of some social significance in the way that all such events are in small counties where everyone knows everyone's business. She wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and showed the careful maintenance she had given it over the years she had owned it. Clara helped her with her hair and supervised the process with an imperious certainty that made Elsie shake her head, and also love her daughter with a fierceness that was almost painful. Pete said, "You look lovely, Elsie," when she came out, and then very studiously went back to fixing the handle on a pickaxe, and Elsie said, "Thank you, Pete," with a warmth she could not quite suppress. Marshall Norris, when he came to collect her, stood at the kitchen door and looked at her and said, "You look very fine," which was simple and sincere and better than any number of elaborate compliments. They ate at the hotel dining room in Fort Stockton, which was not elaborate but was good, and they talked for 3 hours, and she learned more about him in that evening than she had in all the previous months combined. About the brother he had who worked cattle up in Colorado, and who he wrote to twice a year. About the family he had not spoken to in a long time for reasons that were complicated, and that he was willing to share with her because she asked. About the years before Kansas. About the things he wanted that he had not yet had. She told him about her parents, both of whom were still living in San Antonio, and who wrote her faithfully and worried about her faithfully, and would be exceedingly interested to hear about these particular developments. She told him about her first years on the land with Thomas, the specific texture of that life, the joy and the difficulty woven through each other in a way that made it impossible to have one without the other. She told him about the day Thomas died, which she had never told anyone in full, only in pieces, and she told it all to Marshall Norris over a cup of coffee in the Fort Stockton Hotel dining room, and he listened to all of it, and at the end he put his hand over hers on the table, which was forward and was also exactly right, and said, "He sounds like he was a good man," and she said, "He was the best kind of man," and then she said, "And so are you," which she had not entirely planned to say out loud but which was true, and which made Marshall Norris go quietly still in the way he did when something mattered. He walked her out to his wagon at the end of the evening, and the night air was cool with the first real edge of autumn in it, and under the Fort Stockton street lamp he stopped and turned toward her and said, "Elsie," in a way that made it a complete sentence. She looked up at him. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it." "Marshall," she said, "you have been coming to my farm at least twice a week for 4 months, and you brought me a book, and you helped with my sorghum, and you taught my daughter the names of the constellations. I believe we are already past the opening stages." The smile that crossed his face then was the most completely unguarded thing she had seen from him, and it was, she thought, extraordinary. "So that's a yes." "That is a very definite yes," she said. He drove her home in the wagon under the October stars, and at her gate he helped her down and held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and then touched her face briefly, gently, with his other hand in a way that was more intimate than a kiss and more honest than a promise. And then he got back in the wagon and drove away while she stood at the gate watching him go and knowing, absolutely and completely, that she was in love with this man. She had not expected to be in love again. She had, on her worst nights, suspected that the part of her that was capable of loving that way had been buried alongside Thomas in the Crockett County cemetery. She had not been looking for evidence to the contrary. She had been planting her sorghum and managing her land and raising her daughter and getting through the days one at a time, which was all she had been asking of herself. She went inside and sat in the kitchen in the dark and listened to the wind moving through the sorghum stubble in the south field, and she thought, "Thomas, I hope you don't mind. I think you'd like him. He helped with the sorghum without being told." The rest of the autumn was a season she would remember for the rest of her life with a particular golden quality, the way some seasons settle into memory as a whole thing rather than a series of events. Marshall came regularly. They talked and worked the land together on the days he had time and rode to town twice more for supper. He met her parents when they came to visit in November. Her father and mother made the journey from San Antonio, ostensibly to see Clara and to check on Elsie, and in reality to look at this deputy who had been mentioned in Elsie's letters with a frequency that had apparently set off certain parental alarms. Her father was a shrewd, quiet man named Arthur who said very little for the first half of the visit and watched Marshall carefully, and then at the end of the second day sat down with Marshall on the porch and talked to him alone for an hour, after which he came inside and said to Elsie with characteristic brevity, "He's good." Elsie's mother, whose name was Ruth and who had always been more demonstrative than her husband, declared Marshall Norris to be handsome and sensible in the same sentence, which was her highest compliment. Clara had already formed her own assessment and was not interested in revising it. She liked Marshall. She had liked him since the cattle conversation on the porch, and she had approved of his increasing presence in their lives with the decisive authority of someone who has been thinking carefully about what the household needs. Elsie watched all of this happening around her and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the sensation of things being in their right place. December came and brought cold nights and the particular stillness of a farm in winter, when the growing season is over and the land rests, and the days are short and there is time to think. Marshall and Elsie had established a pattern that felt, without anyone quite declaring it, like the pattern of two people building a shared life. Sunday suppers, long conversations on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cold, occasional rides through the county that were partly his work and partly just being together on the land. Clara came on some of the rides and talked continuously and pointed out things she had learned in school, and Marshall listened to all of it and asked follow-up questions that she appreciated enormously. One Sunday evening in December, after Clara had gone to bed and Pete had long since retreated to his cabin, Elsie and Marshall sat by the kitchen fire and Marshall said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take as long as you need before you answer." She looked at him across the firelight. "I know you have built this life here," he said, "and I know what this land means to you and what this farm is. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me be part of it, properly part of it." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Elsie." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the winter-bare fields. Elsie looked at the man across from her, who was watching her with those steady brown eyes and that absolute willingness to hear whatever she said, and she thought about 3 years of stubborn sorghum planting and grief and endurance, and the slow, unexpected returning of things she thought she had lost. She thought about Thomas, who had been the kind of man who would understand this, who would want this for her. She thought about Clara, who had said to her once, with a 9-year-old's casual cruelty and total accuracy, "Mama, you don't laugh enough." She laughed when Marshall Norris asked her if she even liked the sorghum. She thought about that laugh, the way it had surprised her, come up from somewhere deep and real, the way it had startled both of them on that April porch. "Yes," she said. "Marshall, yes." The smile he gave her was the same unguarded one from the evening in Fort Stockton, but bigger, and he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she held on, and they sat by the kitchen fire, while the December wind moved through the empty fields outside. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the silence around her felt full rather than hollow. They were married in the spring of 1886, before the sorghum planting, which Elsie found privately appropriate. The ceremony was at the small church in Fort Stockton, and it was attended by her parents, who came from San Antonio again and seemed genuinely happy in a way that was visible from across the church. Pete Garland sat in the front pew and cried, which he denied afterward with a vehemence that convinced absolutely no one. Clara was the most composed person in the church, which was characteristic, and she stood beside her mother with her best dress and Thomas's dark eyes and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this and is finally satisfied. Marshall's brother came down from Colorado, which had involved considerable travel and which meant something. His name was Daniel, and he was taller than Marshall and louder, and had the same brown eyes and none of the same quietness. He and Clara got on tremendously well, which meant the reception was somewhat louder than it might otherwise have been. Elsie wore a dress that her mother had helped her sew from fabric they had selected together in San Antonio, white with small blue embroidery at the collar, and she stood in the church and looked at Marshall Norris and said the words that made them married and felt them be true in every part of her. After the ceremony, standing outside the church in the spring afternoon while people threw rice and someone laughed at something Pete said, Marshall put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he said quietly, "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking the sorghum goes in next week, and the south field needs the drainage ditch checked before we start." He laughed, which was a sound she was still learning and still delighted by, and said, "So married life begins as it means to go on." "Did you expect otherwise?" she asked. "Not for a minute," he said, and kissed her, right there on the church steps in front of Pete and her parents and the entire social life of Crockett County, Texas. The first season of their marriage was exactly what she had told him it would be, full of the work of the land, the sorghum going in and growing through the spring and summer with the same stubborn determination it always had, while Marshall balanced his deputy work with increasing involvement in the farm. He was good at it, it turned out, not because he had farmed before, but because he had the same quality as a farmer that he had as a lawman, which was that he paid attention, and he worked from what he actually saw rather than what he expected to see. He also, at some point in June of that first married summer, standing in the sorghum field with grain syrup from the processing sticky on his hands and an expression of genuine surprise, said, "This is actually not bad," about the sorghum syrup Elsie had poured on his cornbread, and she said, "Thomas always said so," and Marshall said, "Thomas was right," and they stood in the kitchen in the summer evening, and the weight of that was not grief but something else, something gentler. An acknowledgement that the past was part of the present, and that was not a bad thing. She planted the sorghum the next spring too, and the spring after that. But it was different now, because now she planted it with Marshall's hands beside hers and Pete's and Clara's, and it was no longer an act of pure stubbornness, or not only that. It was still stubbornness. She was constitutionally incapable of abandoning a position she had held through genuine difficulty, but it was also something else, a continuation. A thread running from Thomas's land through the present into whatever came next. In the autumn of 1887, she discovered she was expecting. She told Marshall on a Tuesday morning when the harvest was halfway done, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and him across from her with the particular focused attention he always gave her when she was about to say something important. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her and took her face in his hands and said, "Elsie," in the same way he had said it the night he asked to court her, which was the most complete word in his vocabulary, and she laughed and put her hands over his and said, "That's all you have to say." And he said, "Give me a minute," and she could see he was taking it in, all the enormity of it with those eyes that missed nothing. "Are you happy about it?" he asked. "I am terrified and overwhelmed and extraordinarily happy," she said, which seems about right. Yes, he said, that seems exactly right. Clara, when she was told, received the news with a brief, careful silence that made both her mother and Marshall very still, because Clara's silences always meant she was processing something significant. Then she said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Elsie said. "I'd prefer a brother," Clara said, with the authority of someone making a reasonable administrative request. "Boys are easier to manage." "Is that so?" Marshall said, with absolute gravity. "In my experience," Clara said, referring to the experience she had gathered from the boys at her school, which was the entirety of her evidence base. The baby came in the spring of 1888, a boy, which satisfied Clara enormously, born in the same house where Thomas had died, and where Elsie had planted her first widow's row of sorghum. And they named him Thomas, because it was the right name, and also James after Marshall's father. And so he was Thomas James Norris, and he arrived on the world making more noise than seemed possible for something so small. And Marshall held him with the careful reverence of a man who has been handed something he does not know how to be careful enough with. And Elsie watched her husband hold her son, and felt something in her chest that had no name she knew. Pete went home to his cabin and, according to Clara, who had been following him to report on developments, cried twice. He continued to deny this. Life on the Callahan Norris homestead, as Elsie had taken to calling it, because it was both of their names and both of their histories, and she saw no reason to erase either, settled into the particular rhythm of a family that is actively and deliberately building something together. The farm grew. Marshall had formal arrangements established that allowed him to base his deputy work primarily from the homestead, rather than riding all the way to Fort Stockton each day, which was an arrangement the new county sheriff was willing to make because Marshall Norris was good at his job and available for situations when needed. They added a second field in the East Quarter. They expanded the barn. They acquired 3 new milk cows that had opinions, and a workhorse that Marshall named Chester, and that Clara had strong views about the appropriateness of this name, and a dog that had no name at first because every name that was proposed was rejected by someone in the household until Thomas, who was 2 years old and had opinions well beyond his years, said something that sounded like copper, and that was his name from then on. The county changed around them, the way the West was changing in those years, slowly becoming less raw at the edges, more settled, the violent unpredictability of the earlier frontier giving way to something that resembled, increasingly, the kind of community that could support a school and a proper church, and a general store that stocked more than the bare necessities. There were still hard times. There was still drought and hardship, and the particular difficulties of land that did not give up its yield easily. There was still, occasionally, the kind of trouble that required Marshall to ride out at night with his badge and his careful judgment, and Elsie would lie awake on those nights until she heard hoofbeats coming back through the gate. But there were no more nights like the nights after Thomas died, when the silence was a weight she could not lift. There were difficult nights and worried nights and nights when the land felt overwhelming and the future felt uncertain, but they were always, now, shared nights. There was always someone on the other side of the worry. The sorghum kept going into the ground every spring. In 1890, when Clara was 14, and had announced her intention to go to a proper academy in San Antonio for her secondary schooling, an announcement she made to her mother with such determined certainty that Elsie did not even attempt to argue. Elsie was out in the south field in April checking the soil conditions, the same task she had been performing in this field since the spring after Thomas died, and Marshall came up behind her, and she heard him without turning around. "Southfield looks ready," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "We'll start tomorrow." He came and stood beside her, and they looked out over the field together, the one that had held 8 seasons of sorghum, the one where she had crouched in the dirt with shaking hands in 1882, and planted the first row with a kind of grief-stubborn determination that she still felt in her bones when she thought about it. "Do you know," he said, in the slightly careful tone he used when he was approaching something he was not sure how to say, I've been thinking about what you told me. That first summer. What I told you, she repeated, on the porch, when I asked you if you liked sorghum. He said it with a slight, warm inflection because it was a moment they had come back to more than once in the years since. She smiled. The smile came the same way it had then, from somewhere deep and real, effortless. I told you I didn't like it even slightly. You're still planting it. I am, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Do you still not like it? She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. She thought about 8 springs of sorghum, 8 summers of tending it, 8 autumns of harvest. She thought about Thomas saying there was no finer grain on God's earth. She thought about the sorghum syrup that Marshall now poured on his cornbread with a satisfaction that she found, objectively, ridiculous and also deeply endearing. I have a more complicated relationship with it than I used to, she said finally. I still don't love it for its own sake, but I love what it represents, and I love that you've come to love it, which is something I could not have predicted. That first time I tasted the syrup, he said, I almost told you Thomas was right. You did tell me Thomas was right. I did, he said. Was that all right? She turned and looked at him in the April morning. This man who had ridden onto her property on a bay horse 8 years ago and seen the drainage ditch she was digging, and stayed to learn what she had built, and never once suggested that anything here should be different than it was. More than all right, she said. He smiled, and it was still the same smile, the unguarded one, the one she had loved from the first time she saw it in the Fort Stockton Hotel dining room. It had not changed in 8 years except to become more familiar, which did not diminish it at all. Next week, he said, I think we should plan an extra row. Why an extra row? Because the East Quarter is doing well and the additional drainage last fall should support it, and because Thomas James is old enough to help this year and he needs to learn. She looked at her husband, and then over her shoulder at the house where her son was presumably doing everything he was not supposed to be doing, which was the primary occupation of 2-year-old Thomas James Norris at all times. He's 2, she said. Almost 3, Marshall said. And he's been following Pete around the barn since he could walk. He knows more about what goes into this ground than most grown men in this county. He was not wrong about that. Thomas James had a fixation with the farm that went beyond ordinary toddler interest. He followed Pete with an intensity that made Pete both proud and slightly overwhelmed, and he had very strong feelings about the horses that he expressed in a continuous and detailed monologue. All right, Elsie said. An extra row. They stood together for another moment in the April morning, the field waiting in front of them, the house behind them, the land stretching away in all directions under the wide Texas sky. The wind moved through the dry grass of the north field where the stubble of last year's harvest still stood, and somewhere in the distance one of the cows expressed an opinion about something, and from the direction of the barn there was a sound that suggested Copper the dog had found something interesting. Marshall, she said. I'm glad you rode through that gate. He turned to look at her with an expression that was exactly what she hoped it would be. I'm glad you had it open, he said. She laughed. It was the same laugh that had come up from that deep place on the April porch all those years ago, the one she had put her hand over in surprise, the one that Clara had come to the screen door to investigate. It was a laugh that was entirely hers, entirely real, and it rose up into the Crockett County morning and went out over the south field where the sorghum was going to grow again this year, the way it had every year, stubborn and faithful and continuous. The sorghum went in the following morning, all 3 of them, Elsie and Marshall and Pete, and for one triumphant and slightly chaotic row, a small boy named Thomas James who took his job with absolute seriousness and got more dirt on himself than in the ground, and was lavishly praised for his contributions by all parties, which he accepted as no more than his due. Clara came home from school that afternoon. It was her last spring before San Antonio, before the academy, before the next chapter of her life that was already forming around her with the inevitability of Clara's determined plans, and she stood at the edge of the south field and looked at the day's work with those dark Thomas eyes. Good rows, she said critically. "Thank you," Elsie said. "Thomas James helped." "Extensively," Marshall confirmed. Clara looked at her brother, who was sitting in the dirt at the end of the last row, completely satisfied with himself, and then at her mother, and then at Marshall, and something in her expression softened into a thing that was not typical Clara, which was to say it was unguarded and warm and completely honest. "It's a good farm," she said. "It is," Elsie agreed. "Papa Thomas would have liked it like this," Clara said. The evening before Clara left for San Antonio, 2 weeks later, Elsie took her down to the south field in the last of the day's light, and they stood at the edge of the planted rows, the sorghum only an inch high but already undeniably there, doing what it always did. "You'll come home for harvest," Elsie said. "Every year," Clara said. "I'll always come home for harvest." "Good," Elsie said. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and Clara, who was 14 and did not always welcome this, leaned into her. "Your father would be so proud of you." "Which one?" Clara asked, and there was nothing sharp in it, only honest curiosity. "Both of them," Elsie said. "Absolutely both of them." They stood in the evening quiet while the south field held its new season's growth, and the farmhouse behind them showed warm light through the kitchen window, and the sound of Marshall's voice and Thomas James's responses, one low and steady, one high and continuous, came to them on the spring wind. In the years that followed, the farm and the family grew together with the same patient stubbornness that had always characterized the place. The sorghum went in every spring without fail, and Thomas James grew into a boy who could plant a straighter row than most men twice his age, and who had his mother's set jaw and his father Marshall's quiet, watchful intelligence. He was 8 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Ruth, after Elsie's mother, who received the news in a letter that made her cry with happiness. And Ruth grew up knowing nothing but this farm and its rhythms and the big Texas sky above it. Clara did brilliantly at the academy in San Antonio and came home every harvest and every Christmas, and was fiercely proud of both in ways that she expressed through efficiency and competence, which was her language. She eventually studied further, and became one of the first women in the county to teach at the school that had been expanded twice since Elsie's day, which was not a surprise to anyone who had ever seen her interrogate a visiting lawman about the geography of Texas. Pete Garland continued to work the farm until he was 78 and could not be argued into retiring until his knees gave him absolutely no alternative, at which point he took up residence in a room in the farmhouse that Elsie and Marshall had added for exactly this purpose, because there was no version of this life in which Pete Garland was not in it. He spent his retirement years teaching Thomas James and Ruth everything he knew and complaining that they were doing it wrong, and they improved, and he complained that they were still doing it wrong, and this kept everyone happy. In the spring of 1895, Elsie Callahan Norris stood in the south field, the same south field where she had crouched in the dirt in 1882 with shaking hands and a grief too large to name, and she looked out over the rows that she and Marshall and Thomas James had planted that week, and she felt the April sun on her face, and the familiar smell of turned earth, and the particular quality of the Texas air in spring that she had come to love completely. This land that she had chosen and that had chosen her back. She heard footsteps in the soil behind her and knew them without turning. She had known Marshall's walk for 9 years. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at the field together, and after a moment he said, "Another season," and she said, "Another season," and they stood in the particular contentment of two people who have built something real together and know it. "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" he said. "Tell me." "That first spring. When I came by on rounds and you were checking this field and you were covered in mud from that drainage ditch and you shook my hand, which no one else in this county had done." She smiled. "You were surprised by that." "I was," he said. "I thought, there is a woman who does not waste time on what is not necessary." High praise. "The highest I knew how to give," he said, and the warmth in his voice was 9 years deep and entirely unhidden. She turned and looked at him, This man who had asked her an honest question about sorghum and received a laugh in return and had, apparently, decided that that was the thing he wanted to spend his life near. This man who sat in Thomas's porch chair and helped with Thomas's crop and said Thomas was right about the syrup and said both Papa Thomas and Papa Marshall to a dark-eyed girl who needed both to be true. "Marshall," she said. Thank you for asking if I like the sorghum." He looked at her with that unguarded smile, the one she had loved since the Fort Stockton Hotel dining room and loved now in the April field with their children's voices coming from the direction of the house and Pete's unmistakable grumbling audible from the barn. "It was a reasonable question," he said. "It was the right question," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him the way she always did, the way that felt, still and always, like the most natural thing she had done in years. The south field spread out before them, the sorghum just beginning, small and green and stubborn in the April earth, the way it had been every spring for 13 years, the way it would be next spring and the spring after that. Above them the Texas sky was immense and blue and entirely indifferent to small human stories, the way it always was. And below them, the land held the roots of everything they had planted, Thomas's crop and Thomas's daughter, and the drainage ditches, and the grave in the county cemetery, and the new farmhouse room, and all the seasons of labor and the boy who followed Pete around the barn, and the girl named after Elsie's mother and the dog named Copper who had died 2 years ago and been mourned by the whole household, and the years of suppers and conversations and quiet evenings by the kitchen fire. All of it in the ground. All of it still growing. Elsie Callahan Norris put her hand over her husband's where it rested on her shoulder, and she looked out over the south field, and she was, in the full, complete, unhurried way of someone who has arrived at a place they intend to stay entirely at peace. The sorghum could grow. The sorghum would always grow, and she had long since stopped being neutral about that.